Good morning, everyone. We have quite a lot of people joining us this morning, so I'll just give it a few seconds as we're all joining the webinar. Got attendees coming in thick and fast, so I'll just give it another few seconds before we get going. All right, with that, we're starting to settle down. So, in the interest of time, I'll get us going this morning. So, hello and welcome to today's webinar on how to build change capability with structure and intent. My name's Reese, and I'll be leading the engagement in today's webinar. Please note, although the scheduled webinar is for an hour, it could run over depending on the extent of interaction and questions that we receive from you. The webinar slides will be made available in your chat pane in a few moments' time. If you're using the browser-based version of Zoom, you may not be able to see the files in the chat, but don't worry about that. We will be sending emails shortly after the webinar, probably the early part of next week. And within that email, there will be a link to the slides. So if you can't access them this afternoon, rest assured you will get them early part of next week. In today's webinar, we will also be using some polls that will appear on screen for you for some participation. So if you want to get involved, open up a separate browser window now or open it up on your mobile device. That's what we recommend so that there's no disruption between using the polls and watching what's on screen. But either way, if you open up a separate browser window, head to pollev.com/CMC Stewart, and you should see that on the bottom left hand on your screen as well. You'll be ready for our polls in a few minutes' time. I'll also pop that into the chat for you as well in a few minutes. So, if you're new to us, we're Prosci Europe, formerly CMC Partnership Global and Nexum. And for decades, we've been helping individuals and organizations to develop their change skills. Our mission is helping you to accelerate the delivery, adoption, and usage of new ways of working. CMC Global and Nexum initially came together as one organization at the end of last year. In April, we then became part of the Prosci family and are now known as Prosci Europe. Prosci Europe is the sole provider of Prosci change management training conducted in person and virtually across several territories, including the UK and Ireland, Italy, the Nordics, and Scandinavia, amongst others. We also offer private training, which can be facilitated globally at a venue of your choice anywhere in the world. So for more information regarding our range of services, continue to head to our historical website, cmcpartnership.com or nexum.eu. And if you'd like to know more about how we can work with your organization and your various options, again, head to either website, cmcpartnership.com or nexum.eu. So with that, our presenter today is Stuart Watson. Stuart is a Prosci Certified Advanced Instructor and Change Management Consultant at Prosci Europe. Based in, I say Prosci Europe, Stuart. I'd probably just say Prosci as you're based in South Africa. But Stuart has over 20 years professional experience working within multiple sectors, including financial services, oil and gas, and retail. And with that, I'll hand over to Stuart to introduce today's webinar.
Hi, good morning, everyone, wherever you happen to be in the world. It's our privilege to share this hour with you and take you through some content around how to build change capability. And a couple of thoughts. I'll be looking out for your input on the PolyV questions that will come through, and also in the chat. Reese will let me know what your thoughts and questions are. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to look at a couple of the major considerations around building change capability, like the why. Why would we even want to do that? How? What is involved? And then think about who's involved, and also some timing considerations. When would you want to do that? So depending on your experience with Prosci, and if you happen to have been through one of our programs, you may have heard us refer to the analogy of building a house versus versus a neighborhood. And so just to contextualize what we talk about on the left-hand side of the slide, where we focus on adoption and usage to deliver the people-dependent portion of project ROI. That focus on preparing, equipping, and supporting employees is essentially change management within a particular project context. And we like to think of that from an analogous perspective to building a house. So actually focus on a specific outcome in a particular context. But what we have to accept is that is always happening within the context of a broader environment. So think about the organizations that we work within. If you're embedded in an organization in a change capacity, or if you're working as a consultant, you accept that when you're delivering change in this particular setting on a particular project, that's happening within the context of the DNA or the broader fabric of the environment that you're working within. So enterprise change management is essentially about the facilities, the infrastructure, all of the components of the environment that actually make it possible for us to successfully enjoy the benefits of our delivery, given that the environment is actually supportive of that. So in some respects today, our focus is actually on understanding what needs to be in place in the broader environment. What does that look like? How do we measure it? And how do we build enterprise change capability? So thinking about what is change management as a core competency. So when you think about the concept of change within the neighborhood or within your particular context or environment, think about it as what it looks like in terms of the culture of the organization. Is it something that is part of who we are and what we do? Is it expected to be part of the way we approach projects in our organization? Is it embedded within the fabric of the organization? And I'm sure maybe depending on the breadth of your experience, you may have come across organizations where change management is an afterthought, or possibly even something which is left off the table until the last minute. Or perhaps had the pleasure of working in environments where it's top of mind and it's the first thing people consider. So depending on your experience, the question is, what is it all about? Why would we even want to build it? And we'll look at that in detail today. So let's have a look at the why. Firstly, why would we be interested in building change capability at an enterprise level? Well, the first reason we're going to point out is some data from one of the pieces of work that's part of our Prosci world is a change management maturity assessment, and that's basically assessing organizations' maturity across a number of levels. So starting at a base level, a level 1, which is where change management is completely absent or ad hoc, all the way to a level 5, where change management is an organizational competency. Now, we have a specific tool, a maturity model assessment, that we use to help organizations understand where they are in relation to those levels. And we have some data indicating that organizations with higher change management maturity actually have higher project portfolio success rates. So you can see for organizations with a level 5, their percentage success rate for project portfolios is 66% versus only 43% for level 1. So a good reason based on our data and based on a reflection of change maturity against achieving your success rates. A second reason really considers the context of the environment that we're dealing with in 2023. To be fair, this type of reflection of bigger change, faster change, more complex change, more cross-functional, more information, and also a world which is volatile and uncertain and complex. And we've essentially been dealing with this for probably the last 30 to 40 years in Venice, although it seems to have accelerated significantly over the last certainly the last 5 years. I mean, even without a pandemic, we've been noticing these trends increasingly. Of course, technology change is again something we've been saying over and over again, but all of a sudden things like artificial intelligence have just exponentially changed the landscape. So a really good reason why we should be focusing on the people side of change is because we really just are facing a significant increase in the volume, the size, and the pace of change. Another reason why we should consider focusing on enterprise change capability is really to enable or underpin our organizational agility. And what you can see here is some data from a range of different industry studies. So 76% of CEOs have said that their ability to adapt to change will be a key source of competitive advantage. That was a PwC survey. 9 out of 10 executives saying that organizational agility was critical to business success and growing in importance over time. And from a 2012 study on the pulse of the profession, the PMI study in 2012, really equating greater organizational agility with better performance and improved competitive advantage. And I would almost suggest that that's improved competitive advantage is particularly relevant to the people side of change. Technology is, of course, a key differentiator, although its accessibility is widespread, of course. So the technology options are available across the board, so people become a potential differentiator and something that we can consider as something that sets us apart. Something that comes up in our classrooms all the time is the question of change saturation. And Prosci's own study in 2017 reflected that 73% of respondents saying that their organizations were either nearing or past the point of change saturation. So just so much going on in the organization, making it difficult to effectively deal with individual changes. And the reality is that there are consequences associated with saturation. Essentially, the impact on individuals as they try to cope with that volume has an impact in many ways in terms of employee engagement and health levels at a very personal level, and an ongoing impact on projects, and then, of course, the broader organization as well. So another reason why would be to support our strategic execution. So we think about the competitive landscape, having mentioned how technology is reshaping the way we are moving as economies and as a global trend towards innovation. So thinking about the fact that our organizations need to make decisions associated with differentiating themselves, and so it's a strategic imperative to adjust to that. And of course, the people component is directly linked to enabling that. And of course, creating competitive advantage. And as I said earlier, the people component really is a space where we can differentiate ourselves. And really the concept of out-changing being seen as a competitive advantage. So one of the things you'll hear if you listen closely to all the conversations about AI is that huge revolutions or significant revolutions are nothing new. We've been through these experiences before. Think back to the Industrial Revolution, and people have always remained relevant through those experiences. It's just that they change, and they need to change what they do and what they focus on. So once again, with things like AI, for example, we need to change. And so change management becomes increasingly important. Also, the multiple or cumulative benefits of change management. So when you're building a house, perhaps thinking about building your home in a secluded space in a remote part of the country is sometimes nice, and it's enjoyable to be away from the rush. But if building a house is working on change in an individual project, if that's not connected in to the broader organization, well, it starts to get really difficult to get that job done. And therefore, if you have change management applied on multiple projects, the reality is that you start to develop a cumulative benefit, and you start to leverage the benefits associated with that common language and common approach. And that leads nicely into specifically that. So when we start using the same language, talking about the same concepts in relation to change, it makes a big difference, and we begin to essentially benefit from increased efficiency and less wastage when we all know what we're talking about and, of course, why it's important. So a whole range of reasons. I'm not sure to what extent each of these would resonate with you and with your organizations. And so would love to hear from you over on Poll EV. If you've not done so already, you can use the QR code in the top right-hand side of the slide there. That will take you straight to the Poll EV option. Would love to hear from you. Which whys resonate most with your organization? Don't forget you can pop questions in the webinar chat as well. So this will keep changing as the results come in. At the moment, having an embedded change management capability is 21% of you reflecting on that why as resonating. Reducing silos, encouraging cross-org collaboration. Change management really is a discipline that lends itself to cross-org collaboration. Anticipating and planning for changes seems to be coming through pretty strongly. Okay, well, thank you for that. Looks like most of you have commented there. What about this question? Our organization should invest in building change capability because, into your thoughts there, why should you invest in building change management capability?
Whilst we wait for that, Stuart, we've got a question in the chat if you want to take it now.
Go ahead.
Hi, Stuart. Nice to see you again. Just wanted to clarify the point of saturation. Are you referring to too much change going on in the organization? Whilst you're answering that, I'll fix that word cloud for you.
Thanks. Yeah, are we referring to, and the word cloud almost in answering the question is essentially yes, too much change happening in the organization. And that's of course the change that is happening on multiple axes. It's happening in relation to our focus on internal efficiencies and sorting out our own internal structures, and then also in relation to how we are facing externally to the markets. It has something to do with the competitive landscape as well. So there's multiple dimensions that impact on saturation. And essentially what tends to happen is that the organization is very often trying to deliver business as usual, whilst also trying to adapt to those competing forces, so market forces, competitive forces, internal efficiencies, etc. And typically that is reflected in projects and initiatives associated with achieving those ends. And so then you have a clash between trying to deliver what we need to deliver from day to day, essentially run the organization, and then also change it. And very often that's impacting on the same people and drawing on the same resources within the organization. So that saturation reflects a situation where it's becoming increasingly difficult to cope, to carry on delivering what we have to deliver, and also have the opportunity and space to change as well. So why should you invest in building change capability? And with that, my technology has completely abandoned me. Just give me a moment. Let me reshare. So some of the reasons coming through there. Just give us a sec. Felt like a Monday moment there. Just give me a moment. If you had any doubts as to whether this webinar was live, then those should be banished by now. So there you go. Great. Okay, so hopefully my mouse doesn't abandon me again. Why should we drive sponsor engagement, readiness, speed of change, creating value? That's something that is always top of mind for me. How does what we do contribute to whatever that value proposition is, increasing our revenue, decreasing our costs, increasing our efficiencies, and successful adoption of change, improving our project outcomes. I had a client recently in the NGO space talking about what does return on investment look like for us, because we are not profit driven. And what we kind of pieced together, and as we discussed that concept, we realized that the more efficient and the better you're operating and the more effective changes within your organization, you tend to deliver on the outcomes of the initiatives and the outcomes you're trying to reach as an organization, which contributes to additional funding, and also means that you operate more efficiently internally, which has so therefore a dual benefit within that type of setting. Increasing our agility, ROI coming through, clear structure, shared ownership, the common language, tools, and skills. And that doesn't have to be Prosci. It just needs to be common. It needs to be a common language and a common set of tools, so everyone knows what we're talking about when we're talking change. Great. Well, thank you for that. So that's kind of covered the why, or at least some of the why. I mean, there's some thoughts in there. And I guess the question is now how? How do we build enterprise change management capability? And so the question in this instance is, you're always somewhere on this axis, right? Or in this picture, you're kind of somewhere today, and you would have an aspiration as to where you may want to find yourself in the future. So, for example, that 5-tier maturity model assessment I spoke about earlier, perhaps you want to reach a 5 or maybe a 4, and maybe you're at a 1 or 2 right now. But the reality is you are where you are right now. And how to get to where you want to get to is really where we're going to focus now. So perhaps before we dive into some thoughts and give you some ideas, again, whilst we're in the PolyV flow of things, where is your organization on your journey to building enterprise change management? Is it something you've thought about? Are there any early discussions in place? Have you started to mobilize? Perhaps in your first year of deployment, or perhaps in over a year into your deployment. So PolyV, let us know, where are you in your journey? Seeing any responses in there yet. I'm not sure if you're able to. Web voting not turned on, couldn't answer. Okay. Maybe pop some answers into the chat that may have something to do with the technical challenge we had earlier. I'll try and fix that in the background. Lovely to hear from you in the chat. And yeah, let me see if I can reboot that in the background and pick up on your answers in the chat. Early discussions taking place. Some of you saying starting to mobilize. Some are saying over a year into deployment. That is pretty exciting to think that you're making that sort of progress. Fantastic. Yeah, so we're going to talk theoretically at what would you look at if you wanted to build capability. So if you're somewhat down that journey, then perhaps what we'll share might give you some cause for reflection in terms of your journey and where have you gotten to. So I'm going to bring up my screen again. There's a chance the PolyV may work later on, but for now, let's look at what that journey involves. And apologies for the technology challenges. Tim saying we have it in larger projects, but needs to do more in embedding practices through all our change initiatives. Something I've certainly experienced in a consulting capacity is very often being asked to help clients on their big picture programs, and then realizing that within that project environment, There are lots of initiatives underway that have absolutely no focus on change at all. So firstly, there's a key word on this slide, and that is in the top left-hand corner, Project ECM. What a lot of organizations don't automatically realize is that building change management capability is a project and therefore needs to be managed, right? And needs to be managed from a change perspective. So that's something to think about. So the question is, where are you currently? What does your transition space look like? And where would you be moving into the future? So where you are currently would be a question of where you sit on that maturity model, right? So think about, what that might be for your organization. And where you want to be in the future is, of course, a reflection on the optimal journey. And that has something to do with the specific objectives, goals, and metrics that you would hope to be able to realize. The question of how to get there involves that transition space. And a fairly complex picture here, which of course we're going to unpack now, is to think about what dimensions would you need to consider in order to get there. And that's what we refer to as a strategy map, an ECM strategy map, and basically acknowledging that there's work to be done in relationship to leadership, what we do on projects, to the skills and capabilities in the organization, to what our structure looks like, and also our processes. How do we embed change into the processes within our organization? And again, a reminder that building change management capability requires change management. So that project would need to be managed from a people perspective. I did mention the maturity model assessment. So at a summary level, this is the tool that we would use, and I'll dive into this in a bit more detail in a moment, but just at a high level, firstly, level 1 would be where change management is either ad hoc or absent within the organization. A level 2 organization, typically you see change management applied on isolated projects. Level 3, multiple projects, so you start seeing change across multiple initiatives. Level 4, where it's become an organizational standard, and ultimately level 5, where change management is a competency right across the organization. And so, for example, at a level 5, when it's an organizational competency, change management is typically seen as critical for the organization, essential on all projects and initiatives, essentially second nature and commonplace. It's typically applied, change is applied at the start of projects and initiatives on virtually all projects and changes, and is essentially inseparable from project delivery processes. So it's actually embedded within those processes. And it's typically applied by practitioners and project teams, by all leaders and people managers, and tends to be centralized as a functional group within the organization. And that would be in contrast to, for example, for an extreme contrast to a level 1, where essentially it's a distraction from installing the technical solutions. And that's often the case in low maturity organizations. The technology solution or the process change is seen as the key driver of value, and the people component is an afterthought. It's typically not applied at all, or perhaps as a last resort. And if it is practiced, it may be practiced by individual practitioners, but not necessarily something that is embedded or utilized by other key resources. So that's just a high level sense of the different levels and what they look like. So we'll now know if my polyp is working. If not, I'll just get a sense from you in the chat. What would you estimate as your organization's current level on the maturity model scale? Seems like we're back in action. Okay, so let's see across those levels. I have to say that in practice, having been in this space for over 20 years, I have not seen a level 5 organization. So if you are in that space, if it is something that's an organizational capacity, that is fantastic. Level 3 and above is really fantastic. That's a great space to be in. At best, a 2. Well, you're on the road. And to those who said they're over a year into building it, another 4. That is fantastic. That is really good to see. Between level 3 and 4, I imagine a significant amount of work has gone into that. That doesn't just happen to get between a 3 and a 4. Okay, 2 to 3, 4. Okay, so quite a spread here. I've seen, okay, so there's a 1. There haven't been too many ones. I imagine the fact that you're here today has something to do with building enterprise change capabilities. So hopefully when we get into the specifics, you'll be able to take something valuable away from that. All right, so those numbers will keep coming in. Thank you. I'm going to kind of bring up some reflection points in terms of what those maturity model scores might look like. So let's say you'd match your score. And by the way, getting to these scores involves running through a detailed series of questions associated with these dimensions, the dimensions you see on the x-axis here. So we assess where you are from a leadership perspective, how change is applied, the extent to which it is reflected in competencies, the degree of standardization with regards to change management, and also how it is socialized within the organization. So those are specific areas that constitute the maturity model assessment. And each of those, as you can see, this is example data, maybe polling at these particular levels. So that's potentially where your current would be, wherever that is right now for this point in time. And then what you might say then is you might take each of these elements of maturity and then reflect on what would potentially our year 1 goal be. Where would we like to lift that to by the end of our first year of focus on enterprise change? And then perhaps our 3-year or stretch goal might be to say, well, perhaps this is where we want to get to in the future. So you can, in essence, see a current transition future orientation reflected in this particular view. So let's think about considering what's happening within your organization. So the first thing you might want to do is consider, within your context, what is, how does change happen? From an initiation perspective, how are changes triggered or launched? And of course, that is typically on the back of key strategic initiatives or projects that are underway to enhance efficiency, increase compliance, decrease cost, etc. So that's change initiation. So what governance systems are in place that might signal the initiation of those changes. And then the question becomes, who drives that change? So, for example, is there a project management office, for example, where people who want to initiate change are required to follow a series of processes to actually formally constitute a project and move through various governance kind of gates to get approval to move forward? How is project management governed or organized in the organization? And is change management in any way built into that, right? Is there something that requires the project governance to reflect on, are we considering the people side? So that's kind of the first thing you might want to consider in terms of the environment. The things that tend to help or hinder our reflection, and certainly from a change management perspective, typically these types of factors. So, for example, the extent to which change management is recognized or acknowledged at a senior level. Resource and funding is always a fundamental question. Where is the initiative actually originating? So, for example, if that is a highly technical change, perhaps technology that is being driven through an IT environment, for example, perhaps and this again is dependent on maturity, perhaps the initial reflection is that it's a technically focused change and doesn't require people. The context, the environmental context with regards to the history of how we have applied change in the past also has an impact. And the amount of change, we've spoken about change saturation, the capacity to deal with that, where we're going as an organization. So these are some of the considerations that would influence essentially influence how we are going to approach change. what we might want to think about is considering our future states, the destination that we're heading towards. Think about it in three ways. Think about it in terms of the enterprise level, what it means for projects and initiatives, and also what it may mean for individuals. So for the enterprise, the future destination might be something like we consistently meet and exceed our expectations in change. We're able to handle the change our organization is experiencing, and we have an organizational footprint for change. So that might be what it looks like at an enterprise level. From a project perspective, you might be thinking about, there's a common language, a standard approach to managing change, and a set of tools which support the application. And critically, that is integrated into our project management approach. And so think about the extent to which that is, in fact, the reality. Consider whether we are appropriately budgeting for and resourcing change on our projects. Is it present at the start of the project, or, as I said earlier, do we wait until a point where we've realized it's now become imperative, we're about to go live, we need to introduce change? And from an individual perspective, think about the extent to which individual employees actually are energized and engaged and wanting to be part of change, as opposed to being fearful of it. And that has something to do with our culture and the way we have managed change in the past. So do we all see leading change as part of our job, as something that is built into the skill set within the organization? And also, are we measured on it? Is it something that we actually measure? Right, so a couple of thoughts here, and I'll pick up on your questions now over on Poll EV. What we statements would you like to add to the list? Right, so what would your future state look like? So I'll go back a slide briefly. This is talking about the future definition. We constantly meet and exceed expectations. We share a common language. We appropriately budget for change. What would you like to add to that in terms of the future state? What we statements would be would reflect where you would like to be in the future?
While those are going through still, we've got a few questions that have come through.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so Joanne, where can we find the maturity model assessment? So that is available as an independent review and study, which we can do with you. So you can drop us a line on that, and we can set up a conversation. It's a series, as I said, a series of questions that we run through to help you determine where you are. So there is some material available for download, and of course this content we've been through today, just to tell you a little bit more about it. Jamie, how about movers and how do movers and shakers? All right, I have to confess, I'm not sure explicitly what you mean by movers and shakers. Do you mean key influencers or people who have a significant impact on change within the organization? Perhaps if you could clarify, I'll do my best to answer your question there. So what statements would you add? An organization that feels... Oh, right. Okay. Jamie, I'll have to come back to you on that. I beg your pardon. I'm not sure if we've mentioned movers and shakers. I'll have to find the context, but thanks for the comments coming in. We see the value in change management across all projects. We're leveraging ECM to deliver positive outcomes. We consistently think of the people side of change in a timely manner. An organization that feels empowered. We all have skill, knowledge, and ability. We have a clear definition of the difference between people change and project change. To build an agile. We understand the value of change management, see it as an investment rather than as an expense. Our leaders understand how to lead change authentically. Sure, that's pretty powerful. If that's the case, we'll have a significant impact. You mostly exceeded expectations. We equally prioritize the people's side of change. Those are some pretty powerful, certainly the leadership piece, and it's evident at all areas in the business. Okay, so let's get into some more specifics. What is involved? So we've thought about those different dimensions, thinking about the fact that there's a current state around where we are in terms of our maturity. The transition is about where, what we're going to focus on to get to the future state. And also using the maturity model assessment, we can explicitly measure where we are and how we're progressing against those targets. So the question of specifically what is involved is what we're going to look at now. And the different dimensions on the strategy map are equally important, I would say. They're all contributing factors to building enterprise change management. And the first aspect we'll pick up on is leadership. And if you've had any involvement or experience with the Prosci approach to change, you'll know that our best practice report is a fundamental part of our value offering. And in that best practice report, active and visible leadership has emerged in all 12 of Prosci studies as the most the biggest contributor to success. And so when we're trying to build change at an enterprise level, this is absolutely the area we need to think about first and foremost. Secondly, we need to think about how is change applied in projects. So how are we actually applying change? Thirdly, skill. One of the things we often talk about is who does the work of managing change in an organization. And in essence, that is well and way beyond purely the change practitioner. Our leaders or sponsors and our people managers are critical role players. How do we leverage the support of our learning and development teams, our communication teams, etc.? So one of the things we need to think about is the broader capabilities within both leadership and people management tiers, as well as the capabilities that exist in other areas, like, for example, comms, training, etc. Then thinking about structure, is there a formal structure within the organization that has roles and responsibilities associated with supporting the competency as an established field within the organization? Is somebody actually taking accountability for making sure that change is embedded, that there is a focus on a common approach, that it is being applied to projects, etc. So in other words, is there something formal existing within the organization to support the capability? And then also from a process perspective. So each of these areas equally important and considerations that are part of the journey of building change capability within our organizational setting. So think about what it might look like in terms of your aspirations and goals. So of course, whilst they're all equally important, it's not possible to instantly address all of those areas at the same time. So back to our reflection on what might you want to do in year one, and what are your 3-year aspirations? So for example, perhaps you would say, well, in the first year, we're going to put our focus onto leadership in the project space, and then perhaps skill, process, and perhaps slight focus on structure. But we would then want to build on that as we move into our kind of 3-year aspiration, as an example. So that's kind of the what. There's a timing consideration, of course. What would you need to do? What specific initiatives would you focus on to actually get the ball rolling? How would you gain momentum or build momentum? And what would you need to do in terms of sustaining that? So again, that's going to be different for different organizations, and different areas are going to have specific areas that they feel are ones that would add the most value, perhaps. So potentially focusing on applying change across projects, and that might be a short-term quick win space, for example. I'd also suggest that the process piece is a unique opportunity to potentially build your change management processes into your project governance framework, for example, and that would support the focus on building change at a project level as well. So the question of who, and again, we can look at those different areas, but we need to understand who specifically is going to actually support the development of ECM. So our role players would be, and again, terminology may differ from organization to organization, but essentially you'd be looking at the following kind of high level roles. You'd be looking for someone who takes responsibility as an executive sponsor. So that one person who's ultimately accountable for driving the initiative. And the expectation for someone at that level is that they would role model the key sponsorship behaviors. So the ABCs that we talk about, being active and visible, building a coalition of support, and communicating with those who are directly impacted by the change. And the change in this instance, once again, to reflect on the fact that that is the change associated with building enterprise change management. Providing the funding and really signaling to the organization that this is something we are going to invest in, ensuring that peers at their level are supporting the initiative, and then holding, and of course, to that point, holding the broader steering committee accountable for supporting that. So that might be where you look at the coalition, so the additional or other key members within a leadership context who could support this and help to build the organizational narrative, potentially removing barriers and addressing any issues associated with that. And then from a core team perspective, who would be part of the team that builds this, right? So you might need to identify definitely a project manager, definitely somebody who can look at the people components associated with this, and that might lead to some very specific expectations around, the rules of engagement, how are we going to tell the story, how are we going to prioritize, etc. And I guess, out of that core team, you might want to indicate a specific deployment leader who's going to manage the day-to-day activities. So perhaps some thoughts from you. Be great to hear what you would consider in terms of the status of, so those who are on this journey, right? Do you have a deployment leader, somebody who is leading the development of enterprise change management? Is there someone, is this perhaps a dedicated role, someone who has capacity? So let's see your thoughts there.
And just checking still, if we covered off the question that was in the Q&A.
Yes, which one specifically? I might be behind.
Would you define ECM as being highly coordinated and prioritized changes as opposed to lots of change initiatives being launched with no coordination?
Right. So, buildings, just say that again. There was a...
So would you define ECM as being highly coordinated and prioritized changes as opposed to lots of change initiatives being launched with no coordination?
Yeah, I would say that's one dimension of. So let me just land these responses, and I've got a slide I want to show you around that specifically. So your answers here, you don't have one. Okay, so that's something to think about. Is it someone who is offsite? So dedicated role. So 9% of you have dedicated role, but without, that's concerning. If you've got the role, but without capacity. Or perhaps distributors. Okay, so it looks like a reasonable spread, which is interesting, of course, depending on where you are on that journey. And I would like to think that as you build momentum, it's certainly going to, as you get to the more complex elements of building ECM, it's going to be clear that there's definitely going to need to be somebody who's formally driving that. So back to the wheel to answer that question. Just going back a little bit. So is it highly coordinated or lots of changes? So I would say in relation to this picture, remember these are individual dimensions, right? the question of how you're applying change in individual projects. So that has something to do, are you following a uniform approach, and is change management built into, I would say it touches on two dimensions, touches on process and project. In other words, is there in your project governance framework, for example, a standard approach to integrating change into project delivery? And if that's the case, well, then you're likely to get change management being applied across multiple projects in a consistent way. But achieving this particular dimension also requires a degree of focused intent to say that, for example, we are only going to deploy a dedicated change specialist for projects of X degree of value or X amount of budget, for example. And so there might be some decisions associated with which projects you're going to focus on. So to your point, is it going to be across all projects, and is it going to be highly coordinated? That would be a function, I would say, of those two dimensions, essentially both process and project. Okay, so we've gotten to the who and who would be involved, and quite a spread in terms of your own experience, in terms of who's specifically involved across these two areas. So let's move on to the thought that the roles that you have, and if I can bring this slide up again, just to think about who's going to do what. And I want to be, very explicit about the focus. When we talk about building enterprise change management, we're considering this as a specific project in and of itself. So in other words, does the building of ECM have these role players to support that journey? And the second question then becomes, okay, so if I have that role player in place, does that person have the necessary capability, right? So, for example, we might say, if I have a sponsor, does that sponsor have the ability? And of course, you can see we're utilizing the ADCAR model here to consider whether the individual driving that particular initiative actually has what is required rather to be a good sponsor. And so we use the ADCAR model here to actually understand, well, first question in an individual's journey towards becoming a good sponsor is, do they understand or have awareness of what it means to be a good sponsor, why it's necessary, and the risk of not being a good sponsor? Have they made a decision? So is the desire piece in place? Have they decided to participate and support the change? Do they know how to be a good sponsor? It's not a given. That's something to reflect on. And of course, all of those would then, in a sequential way, contribute to the ability component. And then finally, is there reinforcement in place to ensure that good sponsorship is in fact going to be sustained? So those are fundamental questions, and actually they apply to all of those role players, all the way from the sponsor to the individual people managers, project manager, the person driving the change, the people who are working as part of the broader sponsor coalition. So all of these role players who are required to support building ECM, they need to firstly have clarity on specifically what it is, what their role involves. And if you look at their ADCOP profiles, the fundamental question here is, do they have the ability to play the role that they need to play? So, it's one thing to look at what needs to be done, but if your deployment leader, and thinking back to your responses on the PolyV, if you have one and that person has the capacity, the question around capability becomes important, and that can make a fundamental difference in terms of how you move forward. So if you are, for example, and I mean, I know this is just example data, but if you look in the ability space here, if there are potentially areas where there are challenges associated with that ability, you might want to think about, what could you do? What specific tactics might you consider to actually address that? So if the barrier point happened to be in the awareness and desire space, for example, so what you might consider to address that might be providing some context and perhaps a sense of why that's important and how enterprise change capability contributes to overall program outcomes, for example. So those are some of the things you can think about. What about knowledge? If knowledge and ability is a challenge, we need to think about what specific capability programs we could consider to help with that particular space. So consider the opportunity to engage our sponsors and key leaders in a half-day program on the role of managing change as an executive, as a sponsor, for example, or people managers, how to lead your teams through change. So it's the role, and those of you who've been through our certification programs would be aware that if you are struggling with the resourcing in your project team, it becomes your responsibility to make sure that you consider what could be done to unblock, what can be done to address the barrier points. So those are some engagement tactics to think about. Of course, it will be different for different people. So that was our reflection on who, and I'll perhaps just pause at that moment if I missed any questions in the chat, Reese, just fire away.
Nothing at the moment, Stu.
Okay, so with the time we have left, perhaps we can consider the when question. Always critical. We're equally constrained by time. So when, and this kind of goes back to the question around, what is your future, vision? What are you thinking about in terms of that destination? So perhaps you might want to sketch out what would you want to do across a defined period of time. And the question I would ask is, where is your kind of organizational direction over a particular period of time? In other words, is there a Vision 2025, or is there a specific set of initiatives underway to deliver on a particular strategic imperative? And that might be a useful framework within which one could consider, how do we support that delivery with our own focus on building a future state that will take the organization into the future. If that's the case, if there's a short-term focus, let's say, short-term might be considered a 2025 outcome as an example. If there's a 2025 program, what I might consider is that, well, in year one, perhaps we need to look at individual projects that we can deploy change management on as a support initially, and then focus on some of the other dimensions as an example. So from a timing perspective, those are kind of some of the key things that you want to consider. So I guess the short answer is it's going to depend on your particular context and what might be the most relevant approach to building. You would obviously break this transition space into the specific areas of focus, and you'd also be wanting to prioritize across those different strategy areas as well. So in summary, let's have a look at a couple of keys. Now, what would you do to really get the ball rolling to building ECM? I think step number one is to make sure that you have sponsorship for building change capability. As I said earlier, that's a given. Active and visible sponsorship is the number one success factor for projects, and building ECM is a project. So let's start by securing sponsorship for building that capability. So the questions you might want to ask there are, who is needed? Who do you need to actually engage with regards to that journey? How do you get past people saying, yes, that's important, but deep down there's a lot of other things going on and it's actually just never going to get done? Secondly, and that's what I was saying earlier on the timing question, is possibly you want to demonstrate the impact of great change management by focusing on some very specific projects. And perhaps then the question is, which initiatives would you use as demonstration projects? And also, how would you capture and share the impact that change is having? And then, of course, the question of the structured approach. And, if project ECM is something, sounds like some of you are on that journey, then formally, where are we today in terms of maturity model assessments? Where do we want to get to? And specifically, how are we going to get there? So thank you for your time. From our perspective, of course, happy to have additional conversations around those respective areas. And look forward to ongoing engagements and conversations. Reese, I think you're going to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. As you can see on your screen, there is one final poll. As I propped up this poll, Stuart, there is one final question in the chat whilst people are responding there. So What do you think about using a community of practice and or centre of excellence as a starting point to ECM? And as you're answering that, I'll pop that poll up.
Great, thanks. Well, I would say a community of practice is probably the best possible way to start that journey. I've seen that work powerfully. I've been part of organizations that have actually done that, and it really is. Firstly, it's a low cost approach initially to get people together on as a community, talking about the key initiatives, the key challenges that you're facing, and how do we start creating shared knowledge and repositories of for example, the specific challenges that we're experiencing in different parts of the organization. What kind of resistance are we encountering? What are our best or most effective approaches to managing change? So sharing that knowledge is an ideal place to start, I would say. Centers of excellence tends to be part of the ECM evolution. In fact, organizations that are moving kind of upwards through that level 3 and level 4 are actually targeting a change management center of excellence, which is where you are, for example, having a formal structure in place, where you've got governance, you have roles in place that are looking after the discipline, people who are making sure that there are standard frameworks and standard processes, etc. So I would say the COE, that's the kind of ultimate evolution of where you're heading, and that's the destination you'd be heading for by starting with the community of practice. Excellent place to start. And yeah, thanks for that question.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, as you see the poll on your screen there now. So if you are interested in Prosci training for yourself, or whether you're interested more in organizing Prosci training for your organization, just tick either selection and we'll pass your details on to one of our Prosci colleagues and they'll be in touch with you over the next few days, week or so. And they'll be on hand to answer any questions, provide any more information that you might need going forward. As you might also see on the screen behind any polls, upcoming webinars. So our last public webinar of the series now is next Friday, 3rd November. So that's all about the 12th edition Best Practices Research that was released earlier on this year. So if you'd like to know more about sort of a high level run through of the latest Prosci research, then you'll want to be joining that webinar next Friday. So hope to see you there as well. So yeah, with that, thanks very much for your time, everyone, and holding on a few more minutes after the original end time for this webinar. So yeah, hope you all enjoy your weekends, and we hope to see you on another webinar or at one of our events and training very soon. Thanks very much for your time, Stuart.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.